So I think it's good we start with Surah Al-Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, maliki yawm al-din, iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in, ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim, sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim ghayri al-maghdubi alayhim wa lad-dallin, sadaqallahu al-aliyyu al-azim. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين ولعن الله ولا أعدائهم أجمعين من الأولين والآخرين آمين يا رب العالمين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. So tonight we don't begin with a brother, we begin with the world that the brothers walked in. A world more crowded with thought than perhaps at any moment in Islamic history prior to it. A world in which a Shi'i scholar in Baghdad could not sit down to write a treatise without knowing that in another city, in another court, in another tradition, someone else was writing one too. A Mu'tazilite, for example, in Ray, a philosopher in Isfahan, a future Ash'arite at the head of his own seminary in Naishapur. A world in which the manuscripts circulated faster than the rumors, and the rumors circulated faster than the caravans. And a young scholar in Tus, reading Ibn Sina's Shifa, or Book of Healing, might in the same week be reading al-Murtadha's Shafi. A world that, within a single generation of our two brothers' deaths, would close. And it's in that closing of the world, of that world, and what was saved from the closing, that the deepest lesson of the two brothers' lives is finally to be found. Listen to one very short saying preserved by al-Radhi in the third part of al-Balagha from the lips of the commander of the faithful himself, Imam Ali, peace and blessings be upon him. The saying is, and of course, like with all of these, the references are in the write-up. The saying is, knowledge is better than wealth. Knowledge guards you, and you must guard wealth. 13 or so words. Wealth requires you to protect it. Knowledge, on the other hand, protects you. Wealth, when fire comes, burns. Knowledge, when it has been transmitted to enough hearts and is known, cannot burn, because no fire reaches all of those hearts at once. The 80,000 handwritten manuscripts that al-Murtadha gathered and that his student, Sheikh al-Tusi, inherited would burn in the year 447 of the Hijrah, 11 years after al-Murtadha's death, as I mentioned in the previous session, when the Seljuq Turks took Baghdad and turned the Shia flourishing of Karkh into ash. 80,000 volumes, reduced to absolutely nothing. And yet, what those manuscripts carried, what the brothers and their teacher and their students had spent 2 generations transmitting from the heart, had survived. Because by the time the fire came, the words had already escaped. Tonight, in this 4th and final session of our journey through the Brothers of Baghdad, al-Murtadha and al-Radhi, we walk 3 movements. We walk first into the intellectual world that surrounded the brothers, a world we have only really glimpsed in fragments across the previous sessions, but which really does deserve a full visit, because the brothers were not isolated scholars. They were one node in a network of thought that stretched from Bukhara to Aleppo to Cairo, and the texture of that network is the context in which everything they wrote takes its meaning. We walk second to the burning of their inheritance, the Seljuk fires of 447 Hijri, the library that was reduced to ash, the student fleeing south to a desert town that would one day be called Najaf. And we ask the question that has been waiting for us since the very first session of this four-part mini-series. What survived and why? And then we walk third, and this is the very heart of tonight, the heart of the 4-week journey, in fact, the heart of why we tell this story, to a grave methodological reflection. Because to understand the brothers honestly and to understand the closing of their window honestly, we must learn to read history with a particular kind of clarity. A clarity that distinguishes between the genuine theological commitments of believers across traditions and the political projects, ancient and modern, that have draped themselves in religion's clothing while serving entirely different masters. Without that clarity, the story we have just told becomes essentially a sectarian inventory of grievances. With it, the story becomes what it is always meant to be, a teaching for the community of the awaiting. And we'll close this 4-week journey, by God's permission, where we have always known it would close, at the graves of the two brothers in Karbala, with our eyes raised towards the one in whose service they lived and they died, our beloved Imam, the Mahdi of this age. May our souls be his ransom, and may God hasten his return. So if I can get a loud salawat, then we can move on to the main starting point, which is the intellectual arena. So what Sayyid Radhi and Sayyid Murtadha did, the books, the Dar al-Ilm, the seminary, the students, the dispatching of judges across the Levant, none of it happened in a quiet room. It happened in what may have been the most intellectually crowded moment in Islamic history up to that point. Let me give you a sense of the stage. So first of all, you have the figure that most people picture alongside our two brothers, and it's the man that almost everyone has heard of, Abu Ali al-Hussein ibn Sina, known in the Latin West and through the Latin West to the modern world as Avicenna. He was born around the year 980 of the Gregorian calendar, which is around 369 of the Hijri calendar, which places his birth 21 years after Sayyid Radhi's and 15 years after Sayyid Murtadha's. He was, in the most literal sense of the word, their contemporary. Let me tell you where Ibn Sina lived, because the geography itself tells a very interesting story. And it's a story that connects his life to the same political currents that we have been following for this entire series. Ibn Sina was born, as I said, in around the year 980 of the Gregorian calendar in a village near the great Central Asian city of Bukhara, in what is today the country of Uzbekistan. And Bukhara, at the moment of his birth, was the capital of a dynasty that we must introduce properly, because it will not really come up again in quite the same way within this sub-series, even within the Mahdawiyyah series. The Samanid dynasty was a Persian Sunni Muslim dynasty of Iranian origin. They ruled eastern Iran and Central Asia from the year 819, approximately 203 of the Hijrah, to around 390 of the Hijrah, which is in the Gregorian calendar about 999. They were originally governors who were appointed by the Abbasid Caliphs, and in time they effectively became independent, while continuing in the same fashion as we've seen previously with the Buyids of Baghdad, to nominally acknowledge the Abbasid Khalif in their sermons and on their coinage. Their capital at Bukhara was, in the 10th century, one of the great cultural centers of the Islamic world. The historians tell us that Bukhara under the Samanids rivaled Baghdad, with over 400 madrasas, schools, universities, great libraries, flourishing trade along the Silk Road, and a deliberate Samanid policy of reviving the Persian language and Persian culture alongside Arabic and Islamic scholarship. The great Persian poets Rudaki and Ferdowsi, the polymath al-Biruni, and Ibn Sina himself were all products, directly or indirectly, of this Samanid cultural flourishing. And although the Samanids were Sunni, they were known for their tolerance. 12 Shia scholars, including Muhammad ibn Yaqub al-Kulayni, Sheikh al-Kulayni, who we met in session 63, were given freedom to operate in Samanid lands. Ibn Sina's father was an administrator in the Samanid government. Ibn Sina was educated in Bukhara in the full flood of Samanid scholarship. The Quran by the age of 10, then jurisprudence, philosophy, medicine, the full curriculum of that extraordinary city. But the Samanid state was collapsing, even as Ibn Sina came of age. And the story of how it collapsed is worth pausing on, because it is the first appearance in our sub-series of a force that will, within a mere 2 generations, break the Shia flourishing of Baghdad itself. In the year 999 of the Gregorian calendar, when Ibn Sina was about 19, give or take, the Samanid realm was torn in 2 from opposite directions. From the north, across the river Oxus, came the Karakhanids. And from the south, out of the mountains of what is today eastern Afghanistan, came the Ghaznavids. Both of these were new powers. They were both Turkic. Both of them were Sunni Muslim, or at least nominally. When I say that these powers were Sunni or Shia, it's nominal. And as I've mentioned previously, and between them, these two powers ended the Persian Samanid state forever. Let me briefly tell you who these two were, because they will matter again before the night is over. The Karakhanids, sometimes their name is, it's said slightly differently. It's still Karakhanids, spelling is slightly different. They were a Turkic dynasty descended from the Qarluk Tribal Confederation, which is a group of nomadic Turkic tribes who had dominated the steppes of Central Asia since the decline of the old Uyghur Khaganate in the 8th century. They were originally shamanists with traces of Buddhism and Nestorian Christianity mixed in, until around the middle of the 10th century, one of their khans, their leaders, a man remembered in Turkic tradition as Saltuq Bukhara Khan, he converted to Islam, and people followed him. And the Karakhanids became, as far as the historical record is concerned, the first Turkic people ever to convert en masse to Islam. Now consider that for a little moment. The story of the Turkic peoples as a dominant Muslim political force in the world, which is the story of every Turkic dynasty from the Seljuqs to the Ottomans to the modern Turkish state, begins with the Karakhanids. Now they captured Bukhara in 999, and their descendants would rule Central Asia for the next 200 years. The Ghaznavids, meanwhile, rose from a quite different origin. They were not a tribal confederation. They were, in the first instance, former Turkic slave soldiers known as Mamluks in Arabic, who had served in the army of the very Samanid dynasty that they would eventually destroy. Now, their founder was a man named Sabuktigin, a Turkic slave soldier who had risen through the Samanid military ranks. He married the daughter of a previous governor and had taken control of the small mountain region of Ghazna in what is today eastern Afghanistan. This is where they get their name from. In the year 977 of the Gregorian calendar, around 367 of the Hijri calendar. And it was his son, Sultan Muhammad of Ghazna, who in 998 inherited the Ghaznavid realm and transformed it into one of the most militarily formidable states in the Islamic world of the time. Mahmud of Ghazna is a figure you should remember because his shadow falls on our entire story. He was a staunch, campaigning, doctrinally committed Sunni Muslim. He received formal titles and legitimization from the Abbasid Khalif al-Qadir in Baghdad. The same al-Qadir you will recall from session 66, who had dismissed Sayyid Radhi from his offices after the incident of the Fatimid poem, who privately despised the Shia flourishing that the Buyids were protecting. And Mahmud of Ghazna made himself, in return, the so-called sword of Sunni orthodoxy in the Eastern Islamic world. He campaigned against the Ismailiyya Shia of Multan in India, and he campaigned against the Twelver Shia Buyids in Persia, in Iran. And in the year 1029, or 420 of the Hijri, just 7 years before Sayyid Murtadha's death, Mahmud of Ghazna marched westward. He defeated the Buyid prince Majd ad-Dawla in Ray, which is modern-day Tehran, and annexed the whole of northern Persia into his so-called Sunni empire. Think about what that means. While Sayyid Murtadha sat in Baghdad writing al-Shafi al-Imama and teaching the generation of Sheikh al-Tusi, the Buyid realm at the eastern edge of his world was being eaten away by a militantly, allegedly Sunni Turkic power that explicitly understood itself as the enemy of what the Buyids had built. Ibn Sina himself, the very philosopher we're following, had his library plundered by Mahmud's successor, Mas'ud, when the Ghaznavids briefly occupied Isfahan. And that portion of it was carried off to Ghazna and eventually destroyed. The Ghaznavid rise, and behind it the rise of all Turkic Sunni military power in the Eastern Islamic world, was the first rumble of the storm that would, within a generation, bring the Seljuqs into Baghdad itself and close the Shia window of our story. So when we say that the Samanid state was torn apart in 999 and that Ibn Sina was forced to become a traveler as a result, we're not telling the story about one young man losing his patron. We're telling the opening chapter of the story we've spent this entire sub-series telling. The transition from Persian and Arab Shia dynasties protecting Islamic scholarship to Turkic Sunni dynasties essentially displacing them. Ibn Sina lived the opening movement of that transition. Our two brothers a few years later lived its middle movement in Baghdad. And Sheikh al-Tusi, a few decades after that, would live its closing movements and be forced to flee Baghdad altogether for the desert town of Najaf. All of that was still to come. For now, in the year 999, the 19-year-old Ibn Sina had to find a new patron. Ibn Sina, like many scholars of his generation, had to become a traveler. He moved westward through a succession of patrons and courts, first to Khwarazm, then to Gurgan or Jurjan near the Caspian Sea, where his future biographer Juzjani first met him. Then from around 1014 AD onwards, he moved into the Buyid-ruled Persian heartland, the same Shia Daylamite dynasty we've been speaking about throughout this sub-series. But here we must clarify something that is often missed. The Buyids did not rule their domain as a single unit. And remember, I had said, when I say that this was a Shia dynasty or this is a Sunni dynasty, this is the veneer that they wore. The reality of them was they were using Shi'i or Sunni as a political flag. And I've mentioned this previously. So by Ibn Sina's time, the three sons of Buya had divided the realm into three branches. So the three Shia sons of Buya had divided the realm into three branches. The Buyids of Iraq, that were based in Baghdad, and they were the patrons of Sheikh al-Mufid and our brothers. The Buyids of Fars, they were based in Shiraz, and the Buyids of Jibal and Ray, they were based in the Persian interior, in the areas around Tehran and what we now call Markazi province. These three branches cooperated sometimes and they fought each other sometimes, in the fashion of all dynasties with multiple heirs. And it was into the domain of the third branch, the Buyids of Jibal, that Ibn Sina moved. He served as a court physician to Majd ad-Dawla, the Buyid prince of Ray, and then as a vizier, which is, you could argue, you could say, like a prime minister, to Shams ad-Dawla, the Buyid prince of Hamadan, a city in western Iran that was then one of the three great Buyid capitals. So yeah, for about 6 years, Ibn Sina was quite literally running the government of the Buyid Shia Persian city-state, while composing some of the most important works of philosophy and medicine in the Islamic tradition in whatever hours of the day his duties left him. And here a third dynasty enters the story. When Shams ad-Dawla died in 1021 and the Buyid succession in Hamadan became unstable, Ibn Sina was again forced to flee. He was imprisoned for 4 months in a fortress outside of Hamadan. And when he was released, he escaped, disguised as a Sufi ascetic, along with his brother, his student Juzjani, and 2 slaves, across the mountains to the court of a new patron in Isfahan. And the new patron was Ala ad-Dawla Muhammad, the Emir of Isfahan. And his dynasty was yet another one, the Kakoyids. Now the Kakoyids deserve their introduction because they turn out to be something quite remarkable. The Kakoyids were a Shia Muslim dynasty, again of Daylamite origin, from the same mountains south of the Caspian Sea that had produced the Buyids themselves a century earlier. The founder of the dynasty, Ala ad-Dawla Muhammad, was actually the cousin of the powerful Buyid queen mother known as Sayyida Shirin. His family was related by blood and marriage to the Buyid royal house. He had begun his career as a Buyid governor of Isfahan around 1008 or 398 of the Hijri era. And as the northern Buyid realm weakened, he had steadily built Isfahan into his own semi-independent Shia emirate, while remaining nominally loyal to the Buyids, exactly the same pattern that we've seen again and again in these years of Shia flourishing. In other words, when Ibn Sina escaped Hamadan in 1024 and fled to Isfahan, he did not pass out of the Shia Daylamite world at all. He passed from the Buyid branch into its Kakuyid cousin. The same Shia political ecosystem that protected Sheikh al-Mufid and Sayyid Murtadha in Baghdad was, in different branches, protecting the greatest philosopher of the age in the Persian interior. Ala ad-Dawla, the Kakuyid emir, was, by all accounts, one of the most cultured patrons of his age. Historians tell us that he held weekly academic gatherings in his court every Thursday evening. He gave Ibn Sina the peace and the resources to complete his greatest works. Ibn Sina, it is said, dedicated his major Persian philosophical work, known as the Book of Knowledge, for Ala ad-Dawla to him out of gratitude. And it was in Ala ad-Dawla's service, accompanying him on a military campaign to Hamadan, that Ibn Sina died in 1037 of the Common Era, a year after Sayyid Murtadha's own death in 436 of the Hijri. So when we speak of Ibn Sina as a contemporary of our two brothers, we are not speaking of two men who happened to be alive at the same time in distant corners of the world. We're speaking of two scholarly lives lived inside the same Shi'i political canopy under cousin dynasties of Daylamite origin, flourishing in the same golden window, the window that the Seljuqs were about to close. These were not two separate worlds, they were two rooms of the same house. Sayyid Murtadha in Baghdad, leading the Shi'i seminary, dispatching his Khalifa to Aleppo, his representative to Aleppo, compiling 5 foundational texts of the Hawza, was a close contemporary of Ibn Sina, who was writing Qanun fi al-Tibb, the Canon of Medicine, and Kitab al-Shifa, the Book of Healing, sometimes known as the Cure, in Hamadan and Isfahan, under the patronage of Buyid princes connected to the same dynasty that protected Baghdad's Shia. These were not two separate worlds, they were two rooms of the same house. Important point, Ibn Sina's Kitab al-Shifa, the Cure, contrary to popular opinion, is not a medical book despite its title. It's a vast philosophical and scientific encyclopedia, modeled on the corpus of Aristotle, covering logic, natural sciences, mathematics, and metaphysics. And his book Qanun fi al-Tibb, the Canon of Medicine, would, in its later Latin translation, become the standard medical textbook in European universities for nearly 600 years, taught in Paris, in Bologna, in Padua, until around 1650 of the Common Era. And our brothers in Baghdad sat at the scholarly center of the network through which his ideas flowed. Ibn Sina was not formally a student of Sayyid Murtadha, and Sayyid Murtadha was not formally a student of Ibn Sina. They belonged to different branches of Islamic intellectual life. Ibn Sina to the Falsafa tradition, the Islamic Aristotelian philosophical tradition, descending from the likes of al-Kindi and al-Farabi. Sayyid Murtadha to the Kalam tradition, the Islamic theological tradition that engaged philosophy but did not simply inherit it. They knew of each other. The text circulating in Ibn Sina's Isfahan circulated in Sayyid Murtadha's Baghdad. The students who traveled the Buyid trade routes and the Silk Road carried manuscripts in both directions. What it meant to be a Shia scholar in the 5th century of the Hijrah was to be operating in the same intellectual universe as Ibn Sina, not as a rival, not even as an ally, but as a neighbor, whose arguments you had to have taken seriously, whose books you had to have read, and whose categories you had to engage or be left behind. Our brothers did not shrink from that universe, they walked straight into it. Please give me a loud salawat and we move to the interlocutor, Qadi Abd al-Jabbar and the Mu'tazila. Now the second figure you must picture closely is someone closer to Baghdad, and he's closer to Sayyid Murtadha personally. Qadi Abd al-Jabbar ibn Ahmad al-Hamadani, who died in the year 415 of the Hijrah, 9 years after Sayyid Radhi and 21 years before Sayyid Murtadha, was the greatest theologian of the Mu'tazila school in the early 5th century. Now, the Mu'tazila, you will recall from session 64 in Shaykh al-Mufid, were the great rationalist school of Islamic theology. The scholars who insisted that reason must precede revelation in the ordering of religious knowledge, that the Quran was created rather than eternal, that God's justice required human free will, that anthropomorphic readings of scripture must be metaphorically interpreted. They had been at their peak 2 centuries earlier under the Abbasid Khalif al-Ma'mun, the official theological school of the Caliphate itself. Of course, al-Ma'mun is the Abbasid Khalif who assassinated Imam al-Radhi. By our brothers' time, they had lost that official position, the Mu'tazila, but they remained one of the most intellectually formidable forces in Islamic thought, and Qadi Abd al-Jabbar was their champion. He served as the chief judge in Ray, the Persian city near modern-day Tehran, under the Buyid vizier al-Sahib al-Abbad. He wrote a vast theological encyclopedia titled The Significant in Matters of Divine Unity and Justice, and it ran to around 20 volumes. It was the most comprehensive statement of Mu'tazilite theology ever written. And within it, in its volume on the Imama, he mounted a sustained Mu'tazilite / Sunni critique of the Shi'i doctrine of Imama. And al-Murtadha, from his seminary in Baghdad, answered him. He wrote al-Shafi fil-Imama, the healing on the Imama, which was a direct, point-by-point refutation of Qadi Abd al-Jabbar's volumes. Al-Shafi, the healer, or the sufficient one that cures, positioned deliberately against al-Mughni, which is the name of Qadi Abd al-Jabbar's book, The Sufficient. The titles themselves spoke to each other across the distance between Baghdad and Ray. It is one of the most famous textual duels in Islamic intellectual history. Now, what is striking, and what tells us something about our brother's whole posture, is that al-Murtadha did not refuse to engage with Qadi Abd al-Jabbar. He did not declare the Mu'tazilite theology forbidden territory. He did not walk away. He read and studied the 20 volumes of al-Mughni carefully. He identified the Imama section as the point of greatest disagreement, and he wrote a response that engaged Qadi Abd al-Jabbar's arguments, and this is important, on their own terms, using the Mu'tazilite categories of rational proof, the Mu'tazilite commitment to reason, the Mu'tazilite vocabulary of divine justice, and turned those very tools back against Qadi Abd al-Jabbar's conclusions on the Imama. This is the signature of al-Murtadha's scholarship. He didn't build walls, he walked through walls. And now the third figure. The third figure on the stage was not a single man, but actually it was a school. And it was rising at precisely the moment our brothers were flourishing. The Ash'ariyyah, the theological school founded by Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, who died in the year around 324 of the Hijrah, about 30 years before our brothers were born, had been growing steadily through the 4th century of the Hijrah. Al-Ash'ari had himself been a Mu'tazilite in his early career, and the story of how he broke from Mu'tazilite ideology or theology is actually very interesting and worth telling, because it captures something essential about the intellectual world our two brothers were navigating. Al-Ash'ari had studied for decades under Abu Ali Jubai, the greatest Mu'tazilite theologian of his generation and the head of the Mu'tazilite school in Basra. He had lived in al-Jubai's household. He had become his most prominent disciple. He had himself become an imam of the Mu'tazila, one of its recognized teachers. And then, according to the classical accounts, he put a question to his teacher. He asked al-Jubai about 3 brothers. The first had lived a pious life and died a righteous man. The second had lived a sinful life and died a wicked man. And the third had died in infancy before reaching the age of moral responsibility. What, teacher, al-Ash'ari asked, is the fate of each of them? Al-Jabbar replied, according to the standard Mu'tazilite view, that the first brother would be rewarded in paradise, the second punished in hell, and the third placed in a neutral intermediate station, for he had neither earned reward nor committed sin. But teacher, al-Ash'ari pressed, what if the third brother, the infant, were to say to God, Lord, had you allowed me to live, I would have lived piously like my first brother and earned paradise. Why have you denied me that opportunity? Al-Jabbar replied that God's answer to this would be, I knew that if you had lived, you would have sinned and been condemned. I took you early in mercy. But teacher, al-Ash'ari pressed further, and the references for this are in the write-up. But teacher, al-Ash'ari pressed further, what then of the second brother, the one who lived and was condemned? Could he not turn around and say, Lord, you knew I would sin. Why then did you not take me as an infant too in mercy? And al-Jabbar, the great Mu'tazilite theologian of his age, could not answer this coherently. The biographical sources tell us that al-Ash'ari then disappeared from public life for 15 days of private seclusion. And then he walked into the great mosque of Basra. He climbed upon the pulpit in front of the congregation and publicly renounced the Mu'tazili theology. It is one of the most famous public intellectual conversions in the entire history of Islamic thought. A man at the height of his scholarly authority, tearing down in a single sermon the school he had spent 40 years helping to build. The school he founded positioned itself as a theological middle way, accepting the rational methods of kalam, but pulling back from some of the Mu'tazilites' boldest rational conclusions, particularly around the createdness of the Quran and the limits of reason in matters of divine attributes. And in our brother's time, the Ash'ariyya was in the process of becoming what it would be for the next thousands of years, or next 1,000 years at least, the dominant theological school of Sunni Islam, which it still is to this day. It had a particular strength in the cities of the Persian East, in Naishapur, in Tus, where Sheikh Tusi was born, and it was steadily displacing both the older Hanbalite literalism and the older Mu'tazilite rationalism across Sunni intellectual life. Our brothers did not live to see the full rise of the Ash'ariyyah dominance. That would come in the generation after them. But they lived in the moment when it was becoming clear what was happening. And Sayyid Murtadha, in his theological writings, engaged Ash'arite arguments as carefully as he engaged Mu'tazilite ones. In his treatise on the infallibility of the prophets and imams, Tanzih al-Anbiya wal-A'imma, he had to contend with both Mu'tazilite and Ash'arite understandings of what prophethood required. In his treatise on theology, al-Dhakhira fi ilm al-Kalam, he surveyed the whole theological landscape of his age and positioned the Shia on that landscape with intellectual rigor. And finally, and this is the most poignant detail of the stage our brothers walked, we must name a man who was not yet born when they died, but whose shadow already stretched toward them. Abu Ahmad Muhammad al-Ghazali, who was born in the year 450 of the Hijrah, 14 years after Sayyid Murtadha's death. He would grow up in the Persian city of Tus. He would be trained at the Nizamiya Madrasa in Naishapur, the Sunni institutional network founded, we must remember, by the Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk, deliberately to counter the Shia scholarly flourishing that we've been discussing for these past few sessions. He would rise to become the greatest Sunni theologian of his age and perhaps the most influential single Sunni theologian of the entire medieval period. And he would write in 1091 or 484 of Hijrah, 55 years after the death of Sayyid Murtadha, a book titled Tahaful Falasifa, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, a work that would, within a generation, decisively turn the Sunni theological mainstream away from the Aristotelian philosophical tradition of the likes of Ibn Sina. Our brothers did not know al-Ghazali. and al-Ghazali did not maybe know them. But the intellectual world al-Ghazali would reshape was the intellectual world our brothers had inherited. The Shi'i scholarship that our brothers built, rational, philosophically engaged, committed to kalam and falsafa as legitimate tools, theology and philosophy as legitimate tools, would, in Ghazali's reshaping of Sunni thought, come to look increasingly distinctive. Not by changing itself, but because the Sunni mainstream under al-Ghazali's influence would move in the opposite direction, pulling back from philosophical engagement in a way that the Shia tradition, holding to the path of Sayyid Murtadha, had laid down never would. This is part of why the Shi'i and Sunni intellectual traditions, which in Sayyid Murtadha's time still shared so much common theological vocabulary and so many common philosophical references, would become, over the following centuries, unfortunately, progressively more and more distinct. Our brothers were standing at the last moment when the shared intellectual universe of Islamic theology was still truly shared. And they built into their tradition, into their various books, into their teachings in the Dar al-Ilm, the House of Knowledge, a commitment to philosophical engagement that would outlast the Sunni retreat. The Hawza that teaches Ibn Sina's philosophy today, that reads al-Isharat wa tanbihat, a standard text, that treats Mullah Sadra, who we're going to meet in a future session, God willing, and the school of Isfahan as its own heritage, that produces scholars who move fluidly between fiqh and falsafa, that Hawza exists because two brothers in 11th century Baghdad decided that the answer to the crowded intellectual stage of their time was not to build more walls around it, but to walk through every door. And now let's look at some lessons woven in. Let's draw out what this means for us. Why have we discussed this? We live in our own age in an intellectually crowded moment. We live in an age where on every platform we open, on every screen, in every classroom our children walk into, in every bookshop, in every podcast, every social media feed, ideologies are competing for the hearts and minds of believers. Secular atheism, New Age spirituality, fake Mahdis, consumerist individualism, political ideologies of every shape, color and style, revisionist readings of Islam that would hollow out its core, shallow readings of Islam that would reduce it to mere slogans, hostile readings of Islam that would caricature it into something no Muslim would recognize. And the temptation, the constant temptation, is to retreat, to build walls, to circle the wagons, to declare the intellectual arena of our age haram territory, enter it at your peril, read nothing that is not already from within our tradition. And when you hear that temptation whispered in a lecture, in a Friday sermon, in the advice an elder gives a young Muslim going off to university, remember our two brothers, Sayyid Murtadha and Sayyid al-Radhi. Remember Sayyid al-Radhi reading the Diwan of Abu Tamam in a world where poetry was already become suspect in some pious circles, and writing then his own Diwan and using the same poetic tools that his non-Muslim and non-Shia contemporaries were using, and turning them to the service of God and the Ahlul Bayt. Remember Sayyid Murtadha sitting down with the 20 volumes of Qadi Abd al-Jabbar's al-Mughni, reading every last page, understanding every argument, engaging every category, and then answering from within that shared philosophical vocabulary in a way that a Mu'tazilite critic was forced to take seriously. Remember the Dar al-Ilm, the House of Knowledge, where Shi'i, Sunni, Mu'tazili, Ash'ari, and even non-Muslim scholars sat in the same classroom and studied the same texts. Our tradition, the tradition of Ahlul Bayt, has never feared engagement. It has never needed to, because it has always known that the truth does not lose when it meets other claims in open argument. Truth loses only when those entrusted with it retreat into silence. The scholars of this ummah who shaped our intellectual inheritance did not hide from the intellectual challenges of their age. They walked into them and they answered them. and they won the respect of their interlocutors precisely because they came prepared. And let me add one thing, and it's the thing that matters more, perhaps in our age than in any age before it. Engagement is not the same as aggression. When our two brothers wrote against Qadi Abd al-Jabbar, they did not mock him, they did not abuse him, they did not reduce him to a caricature of his own positions. al-Murtadha read al-Mughni carefully, honestly, in good faith. He represented his opponent's arguments in their strongest form, and only then did he answer them. This is the standard the tradition sets. The Quran itself commands us, invite to the way of your Lord with wisdom and beautiful preaching, and argue with them in ways that are best and most gracious. This is from Quran, Surah An-Nahl, 16th chapter of the Quran, verse 125. Argue with them in the way that is most beautiful, not merely in a way that is merely effective, not merely in a way that wins, in a way that is ahsan, the most beautiful. The Quran does not permit us to choose between being right and being gracious. It commands us to be both. And this is the way of every honorable scholar of the Ahlul Bayt, past, present, and God willing, future. The great scholars of our tradition did not win their their opponents' respect by shouting. They won it by understanding. They did not humiliate their opponents, they answered them. And in answering them with care, with dignity, with accuracy, with grace, they elevated the entire conversation. In our own age, we have inherited platforms that can amplify our voices across the world in seconds. We can argue with strangers at 3 in the morning. We can mock. We can caricature. We can dehumanize with a single clip. A single quote taken out of context. A single insult landed in front of thousands. And too many of our own, carrying the name of Ahlul Bayt on their tongues, have unfortunately done exactly this. Confusing cruelty for conviction, confusing mockery for manhood, confusing the volume of their voices for the weight of their arguments. This is not the way of our brothers. This is not the way of our tradition. When you engage, you must engage. Engage with the honor of those who came before us. Represent your opponent's view fairly and justly. Understand it before you answer it. Speak the truth plainly, but never cruelly. Do not humiliate a person in order to win a point. Do not score victories at the cost of another's dignity. The commander of the faithful, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, peace and blessings be upon him, whose words our two brothers gathered and preserved for us in al-Balagha, said it plainly. People are of two kinds, either your brother in faith or your equal in creation. And the reference, of course, is in the write-up. Every interlocutor you meet, even the one who disagrees with you most fundamentally, is either your brother in faith or your equal in creation. There is no third category. There is no category in which cruelty becomes permissible. Therefore, engage. But engage as our brothers engaged, with rigor, with preparation, with depth, and with the dignity that the tradition of the Ahlul Bayt has always demanded of those who carry its name. This is the inheritance. This is the command. Engage, read, understand, answer. Do not retreat. And may God grant us the wisdom, the courage, the rigor, and the humility to walk in their footsteps. Please give me a salawat, and we move on to the final point, which is the library that would burn. But the story of their legacy does not end at their graves, because the most dramatic chapter of what the two brothers built was still to come. When Sayyid Murtadha died, his library of 80,000 volumes passed, along with his leadership of the community, to his greatest student, Shaykh al-Tusi. And we will be covering Shaykh al-Tusi in a future session, God willing. Shaykh al-Tusi, for the next 11 years, continued teaching in Baghdad under the last of the Buyid protection. adding his own works, including 2 of the 4 books of hadith, to the library his master had built. And then in the year 447 of the Hijrah, a mere 11 years after Sayyid Murtadha's death, the Seljuk Turks, the successors we've been foreshadowing across this whole series, conquered Baghdad. The Seljuks, who were militantly Sunni, or using the name of Sunniism in quite a militant fashion, they harbored explicit and great hostility to the Shi'i flourishing. Because the Shia flourishing was under the patronage of the Buyids. This was a political issue, but they were using religion as a means. They unleashed on Karkh, the quarter of Baghdad, the area of Baghdad, a wave of violence, which was Shia, a wave of violence more devastating than anything that had happened during the Hanbali riots, which we spoke about previously. Sheikh al-Tusi's house was attacked. His library, which was of course the inheritance of Sayyid Murtadha's library, built over nearly a century of careful acquisition, was burnt to the ground. Sheikh al-Tusi himself escaped with his life and a handful of manuscripts, and he fled Baghdad forever, eventually settling in the desert town of Najaf beside the shrine of the commander of the faithful, where he would plant the seed of the Hawza that still teaches there today. 80,000 volumes, reduced to ash. And here is a detail that matters for us. The sources don't tell us specifically what was inside those 80,000 volumes. We know there were classical hadith collections. We know that there were books of philosophy, kalam, poetry, grammar, medicine, and more. We know that Sayyid Murtadha had been copying and preserving manuscripts for more than 50 years. And when the Seljuk fires finally extinguished it all, a silence fell across a great swathe of the Shia scholarly inheritance that can now never be fully recovered. Works of Sayyid al-Radhi and Sayyid Murtadha themselves were lost. Volumes of Sayyid al-Radhi's own Quranic commentary, al-Haqa'iq al-Ta'wil, we only have 1 chapter of that surviving. Most likely they were all in the library. Letters, poems, treaties, drafts, correspondence, all gone. But there was 1 book that the Seljuk fires could not reach. Because by the year 447 of the Hijrah, Nahj al-Balagha had already escaped Baghdad. It had been copied and copied and copied again. Students who had sat in the Dar al-Ilm had carried copies home with them to Tripoli, to Aleppo, to Damascus, to Ray, to Qom. Ibn al-Barraj, who we mentioned in previous sessions, had a copy in Tripoli. Abu Salah, who we mentioned previously, also had a copy in Aleppo. Every scholar who had passed through Baghdad for 2 decades had carried a piece of Nahj al-Balagha out with him into the wider Muslim world. By the time the Seljuks burnt Karkh, Nahj al-Balagha was no longer in Karkh, it was everywhere. It was in the hands of every serious student of the Ahlul Bayt across the Mediterranean and across the Persian world and North Africa. You cannot burn a book that has already been dispersed. And this is perhaps the deepest lesson of the two brothers' legacy. Because when they built their library, they were not hoarding treasure. They were cultivating what we could call a seed bank. Every manuscript they lent, every copy they funded, every student they sent to the Levant or anywhere else with scrolls in his saddlebag, each of these was a grain planted in the soils that the Seljuks could not reach. The library burnt, but the inheritance did not, because the inheritance had already been scattered to places where fire could not find it. This is how a scholarly tradition survives the closing of its window, not by hoarding, but by giving. Now, before we turn to our final eulogy of these 4, let me pause, because something important needs to be said, and it needs to be said very plainly. Across these 4 sessions, we've spent a great deal of time talking about dynasties. The Abbasids, the Buyids, the Fatimids, the Ammarids of Tripoli, the Hamanids, the Mirdasids, and so on and so forth, the Ghaznavids, the Kakuyids of Isfahan, and so on. And looming at the edge of tonight's story, of course, the Seljuks, who will dominate the next few sessions of this sub-series. We have spoken about which of these were Shi'i and which of these were Sunni. We've spoken about Shia flourishing under the Shia dynasties, and Shia scholarship being threatened when those dynasties fell. And I want to be absolutely clear about why we speak this way. Because it would be catastrophically easy and catastrophically wrong to walk away from this 4-week journey thinking that the story of our tradition is a story of Shia versus Sunni. It is not. Let me say this again because it's important and it matters. The story of our tradition is not Shi'i versus Sunni. It has never been. And the great scholars of our school, past, present, and God willing future, have never permitted that framing to stand. This series, the whole sub-series on the architecture of guidance, and the wider series it's part of, stands in the tradition of the martyred Imam Sayyid Ali Khamenei, may God rest his pure soul, his book, The 250-Year-Old Person, which reads the lives of the 14 infallibles not as a list of biographies, but as a single continuous human life, unfolding across 2.5 centuries against the shifting political, social, and intellectual conditions of each age. That is the kind of history we're trying to do here. Socio-political, theological history. Not a list of kings and their dates. Not a scoreboard of Shia victories and Sunni defeats, or Sunni victories and Shia defeats. But an attempt to read the history of our tradition the way the Quran asks us to read history. As a set of ayat, signs from which the believer extracts understanding so that the community that inherits this history can see its own present clearly. And when we do that, when we read honestly, we see something that the simplest Shia versus Sunni framing simply cannot see. We see Sayyid Murtadha writing 20 volumes to answer Qadi Abd al-Jabbar, the Mu'tazilite, and doing so with respect, engaging the arguments and never mocking the man. We see Sayyid al-Radhi compiling al-Balagha, dedicating it to the whole of the Ummah, so successfully that within 2 centuries, the Sunni Mu'tazilite scholar Ibn Abil Hadid was writing a 20-volume commentary on it from within his own tradition, a commentary that to this day is considered one of the most profound commentaries on al-Balagha. We see the Sunni judge, Ibn Khalid of Damascus, preserving the narration of the Alam al-Huda dream in his Wafayat al-A'yun, without polemic, without dismissal, because the story was worth preserving. We see the students in the Dar al-Ilm, the House of Knowledge, Shia, Sunni, Mu'tazilite, and yes, even non-Muslim, sitting together and reading from the same text and learning. We see Fakhr al-Mulk, the vizier of the Abbas al-Khalif, stepping in to lead the funeral prayer over Sayyid Radhi's body when his own brother could not bear to. This is not a story of sectarian warfare. This is a story of a community of faith engaging respectfully with other communities of faith and being engaged with respectfully in return. So when we speak of the Seljuqs or the Ghaznavids before them, or as powers whose conquest threatened the Shia flourishing, we're not speaking about ordinary Sunni Muslims or Shia Muslims. The Turkic peasants who cultivated the fields of Khorasan under Seljuk rule, they are not our enemies. The Hanafi scholars who taught in the madrasas of Nishapur, they were not our enemies. The ordinary pious Sunni believers of 11th century Baghdad, our neighbors, our trading partners, the men and women who bought bread from the same bakers that we did, they're not our enemies. The problem, when there was a problem, was almost never theology. The problem was power. When dynasties, any dynasty of any sect, set about consolidating their political authority, they have historically used whatever ideological tools were available to them to legitimize that consolidation. If the tool, and I'm talking about regimes that are disconnected from God, but they feign godliness. If the tool ready to hand was anti-Shi'i rhetoric, they used it. We saw this with the Al Saud and many others. If the tool was anti-Sunni rhetoric, they used it. And we saw this in the Shah of Iran. If the tool was anti-Mu'tazilite or anti-Sufi or anti-philosophical or anti-scholarly in general, They used that. The driving force was not the theology. The driving force was the power. I'll give you a contemporary example that will clarify everything. In the year 1802 of the Gregorian calendar, around 2 centuries ago, a bit more than 2 centuries ago, the first Saudi state, under the rule of the Wahhabi movement, marched on the city of Karbala. They killed thousands of civilians. They destroyed the dome over the shrine of Imam Hussein. They plundered the treasury of the shrine and carried off 4,000 camel loads of wealth. And a little over a century later, in April of 1925, the third Saudi state, after conquering the Hijaz, leveled the sacred cemeteries of Jannat al-Baqi in Medina and Jannat al-Mu'alla in Mecca, the resting place of Lady Khadija, of Imam Hassan, Imam Hussein, Imam Sajjad, etc., reducing the shrines of Ahl al-Bayt to bare earth where no marker stands to this day. These are among the most painful episodes in modern Shia memory, and it would be the easiest thing in the world to narrate them as Sunni crimes against the Shia, and unfortunately, there are factions who attempt this. But that narrative would be a lie, because the overwhelming majority of Sunni Muslims of every school across the entire world were horrified by these acts. The Ottoman ulama, the Sunni jurists in Baghdad, the scholars of al-Azhar in Cairo, Sunni communities from Damascus to Delhi, condemned these acts when they happened. They were not Sunni crimes. They were the crimes of a particular political project that was using a particular narrow theological justification to consolidate its hold over the Arabian Peninsula. The modern scholarly consensus is clear on this point. The destruction at Karbala and Baqi and Mu'alla was at its core a political act, an act of establishing the authority of a new state, using theology as the instrument of that authority rather than the reverse. And then there is another parallel, Christian Zionism and the Schofield Bible. In the year 1909 of the Gregorian calendar, just over a century ago, a man named Cyrus Ingerson Schofield, an American lawyer and a convert to a particular strand of evangelical Christianity, published, with the backing of the Oxford University Press and the financial support of a circle of wealthy patrons, a work that he titled the Schofield Reference Bible. The Schofield Reference Bible was not a new translation of the Christian scripture. It was the traditional King James Bible printed in its familiar form, but accompanied on every single page by Schofield's own extensive annotations and footnotes. And these footnotes advanced a particular theological framework called dispensationalism, a framework that, among many other teachings, held that the return of the Jewish people to the land of Palestine was a prophetic precondition for the second coming of Christ, and that support for the establishment and defense of a modern Jewish state in that land was therefore a Christian religious duty. The Schofield Bible sold more than 2 million copies by the end of the Second World War. It became the single most influential study Bible in American evangelical Christianity. And it is the theological engine, more than any other single source, of what we now see and call Christian Zionism, the movement of tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of American evangelical Christians who today provide theological, political, financial, and all other types of support for the entity known as Israel, precisely because they have been taught through Schofield's footnotes and their descendants that such support is a Christian religious obligation. Now, I'm not asking you to adjudicate the theology of Schofield's footnotes tonight. That's a discussion for another day. What I'm asking you to notice is the mechanism. A political project, in this case the establishment of a Jewish nation state in Palestine, required religious legitimization to mobilize mass support. A theological framework was found, selectively amplified and popularized. And a generation of ordinary Christian believers who themselves were not politically motivated who were simply reading their Bible in good faith and trusting the footnotes printed alongside the text, were recruited, often without clear awareness from themselves, into supporting a political project that would over subsequent decades contribute to the displacement and suffering of millions of Palestinians, not to mention others across the entire world, including Palestinian Christians themselves, who share the faith of their evangelical American brethren, and whose presence in the Holy Land stretches back to the time of Christ. Peace and blessings be upon him, and may God hasten his return. The theology was a cloak. The political project was the body underneath. And there is one more parallel before I close tonight. And this brings us to the most important distinction of all, the distinction between Judaism and Zionism. Judaism is a religion. It is one of the great monotheistic traditions of humanity. It traces its origins to the prophet Abraham, peace and blessings be upon him, who is also our father in faith. Its scriptures preserve revelations given to the prophets whom we Muslims revere: Moses, David, Solomon, and more. Peace and blessings be upon them all. Its ethical traditions shape the moral imagination of the ancient world and continue to shape it today. The Jewish people are the descendants of those who received these revelations, and they have, across millennia, suffered persecutions and expulsions and genocides, most painfully within living memory, the Holocaust in Europe, though they were not the only people who suffered in the 20th century. Zionism is something entirely different. Zionism is a political movement founded in the late 19th century primarily through the work of a secular Austrian-Hungarian journalist named Theodor Herzl, a man who was not religious, who wrote explicitly that the project he was advancing was a political project for a Jewish homeland, not a religious one. Zionism took the immense and genuine suffering of the Jewish people and their fear of suffering across centuries of European persecution and channeled that suffering into a territorial project, the establishment of a Jewish state, eventually in the land of Palestine, at the cost of the displacement and genocide and Nakba of the people of Palestine, who had lived on that land as Christian, Muslim, and Jew for centuries. And the theological cloak that dresses this political project, the claim that a particular understanding of biblical promises justifies the dispossession of one people by another, is precisely the same mechanism we have just described with Schofield, and the same mechanism we described with the Wahhabi sect of Karbala and Baqi. And here is the crucial point. Many of the most principled opponents of Zionism, historically and today, have been Jews themselves. Jewish scholars, rabbis, communities, movements who hold firm that Zionism is not Judaism, that political statehood is not a religious commandment, that the land does not belong to any nation but to God, and that genuine Jewish faithfulness requires rejecting, not embracing, the use of religious scripture to justify the displacement of any people. These Jewish voices exist, they have always existed, and they deserve to be heard. Because when they speak against Zionism, they are not speaking against their own tradition. They are speaking from their own tradition. They are doing from within Judaism exactly what our own scholars have done within Islam for 1,000 years, refusing to let political power clothe itself in the garments of revelation. We confuse Zionism with Judaism, or to confuse Zionism with Judaism is to make the same mistake as confusing Wahhabism with Islam. Both confusions are wrong. Both confusions hurt ordinary believers, Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, who are then blamed for political projects they never chose, and which their own scriptures, read honestly, do not sanction. And this same pattern can be found wherever religion is abused in the service of political ambition. Not where faith engages the world, because faith must engage the world. That is its entire purpose. But where faith is hollowed out by those who claim it, kept it as an empty vessel to be filled with whatever ambition the moment requires, and then held up as though it were a divine mandate itself. Sometimes we see Trump, we saw Bush doing this. There are those who, claiming the name of Christ, whose message was one of love for thy neighbor and care for the stranger, have used his name to justify the most terrible violence. We've seen this from America. We've seen this from the regime right now. We've heard Hickseth say this. We've heard Trump say this. It's common. In 2011, a Norwegian man by the name of Anders Breivik, claiming to defend what he called Christian Europe from an imagined Muslim threat, murdered 77 people, many of them teenagers at a summer camp. He framed his act as Christian defense. The Christian churches of Europe, almost without exception, condemned him in the strongest possible terms. The Pope condemned him. The Lutheran Church of Norway condemned him. Because Breivik was not practicing Christianity. He was practicing political extremism dressed in a Christian costume. And we could walk this same path through every tradition. Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar, committing atrocities against the Rohingya. Hindu nationalism in India, committing violence against Muslims and Christian minorities. And yes, because honesty costs us nothing, so-called Muslim political movements that have done terrible things in Islam's name, for example Daesh, the so-called Islamic State, which has murdered more Muslims than non-Muslims, Al-Qaeda, whose violence has been overwhelmingly against fellow Muslims, the Taliban, and many smaller sectarian militias that have killed Shi'i and Sunni alike in Pakistan, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. The mechanism is the same every time. A political project seeks mass mobilization. It reaches for the nearest religious vocabulary. It selectively amplifies. It caricatures its opponents. It promises eternal reward for temporal violence. And ordinary believers who in another generation, in another context, would have lived their faith quietly and well, are drawn into acts and attitudes that their own scriptures, when read with care, prohibit. I say all of this now in the closing session of a 4-week journey through two Shia scholars who died 1,000 years ago, because I want us to be absolutely clear about how we read the historical record. The earth belongs to God, and he's not a real estate dealer who allots territory to one people at the expense of another. He is not a respecter of nations. He does not prefer Arabs to Persians, or Jews to Palestinians, or Turks to Kurds, or Europeans to Africans. These are categories of human politics, not of the divine plan. The Quran tells us very, very clearly, O humanity, indeed, we have created you from a single male and a single female, and made you into nations and tribes that you might know each other. Truly the most noble of you in the sight of God is the most God-aware, God-conscious of you. This is from Surah al-Hujurat of the Quran, the chapter of the Chambers, 49th chapter of the Quran, verse number 30. Every human being born into whichever tradition they were born into has a single duty: to survive and to yearn and to work tirelessly towards the truth. And in that striving, to live with honor, with compassion, and with justice. That is the command. The accidents of birth, the tradition you were raised in, the family you came from, the nation whose passport you carry, these are tests. They are not trophies. They are the condition within which you must work out your relationship with your Creator. They are not credentials that elevate you above your neighbor. And this is why when we read the history of our tradition honestly, we do not tell the story of a Shia versus Sunni, or a Muslim versus a Jew, or a Muslim versus a Christian, or anything like this. We tell a story of truth versus the abuse of truth. A story that cuts through every tradition and that finds its honest servants and its dishonest exploiters, and in every community that has existed. And this is the deep pattern that our two brothers would have recognized instantly, because the commander of the faithful, Imam Ali, peace and blessings be upon him, whose words al-Radhi obviously compiled into al-Balagha, spoke about this mechanism 1,000 years before anyone in this hall was born. Anyone in this call was born. He spoke about men who use religion as a cloak for their ambition. He spoke about men who quote scripture to serve power rather than serving power to uphold scripture. He spoke about the poisoning of religious discourse by the contamination of political greed. In Sermon 50 of al-Balagha, Imam Ali says, "The beginning of the occurrence of sedition is passions that are followed and innovations that are introduced. in which the book of God is contradicted and over which men take authority over other men on a basis other than the religion of God. Men take authority over other men on a basis other than the religion of God. This is the mechanism. It has always been the mechanism. And it is the mechanism we see at work whenever we see a Shia or a Sunni or any political authority, medieval or modern, reaching for a theological weapon to serve a worldly ambition. The Seljuqs, when they closed the Shia flourishing of Baghdad, were not doing theology. They were consolidating power. The Wahhabi Saudi state, when it destroyed the Karbala and Baqi and Mu'alla, was not doing theology, it was consolidating power. And the pattern repeats in our own age wherever you see it. So when you listen to this series, when you share it with your Sunni brother, your Sunni neighbor, your colleagues, as I hope maybe we will, please understand what we're doing and what we're not doing. We're not rehearsing grievances. We are not dividing the ummah. We are not saying to be a Shia is to be against the Sunni or to be a Sunni is to be against the Shia. We're reading the history of our tradition honestly, which means naming when they occurred, the moments when particular political projects using particular narrow ideological frameworks moved against our scholars or against scholarship. And in fact, an interesting segue here is, this is one of the reasons why the West and many of these fake Islamic regimes like Saudi and Emirat and all these people, they don't understand the Islamic Republic of Iran or the other resistance movement. They don't understand them because they frame things in their own corrupt way, whereas the resistance axis and Islamic Republic of Iran does not operate in that way. They operate with loyalty only being to God, as we'll find out in the Muharram sessions in a lot more detail. So when the flourishing of Islamic scholarship ended, if you like, or Shia scholarship ended in Baghdad, when the Seljuq closed that window, they didn't just damage the Shia scholarship. They damaged the entire intellectual culture of Islamic Baghdad. The library that was burnt in 447 was not a Shia library. It was a library of Islamic learning accumulated across various schools, across generations, across sects, across denominations, across even religious thinking. Everybody lost when it was burnt. This is the lens through which this series asks that you read it. And with that understanding fixed in our hearts, we can now, God willing, return to the graves of our two brothers and close this 4-week journey where it has always been meant to close. Please give me a salawat. We move to the eulogy, standing together at the graves. Before we close, let us return one final time to Karbala. Across the past 3 weeks, we've stood at these graves twice already. Last week beside Sayyid Murtadha, the week before beside the younger brother Sayyid al-Radhi and his father. Tonight we stand at all three together and we raise our eyes finally beyond them. Let us make the short journey together from this gathering to Karbala. Let us walk through the streets of the holy city, past the pilgrims, the traders, the mourners, past the great golden dome of the grandfather whose martyrdom we mark every year with our tears in Muharram and throughout the year. Let us pass the maqam of Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas. Let us enter the sacred precincts of the Ha'ir, the inner sanctuary of Imam Hussein's maqam. And let us stand in the stillness within at 3 graves laid side by side, 2 brothers and beside them their father. This is where our 4-week story has led us. Not to a conclusion in a library in Baghdad, not to a final lecture in the Dar al-Ilm, but to a quiet patch of soil in Karbala, where the 2 brothers whom God raised up for the Shi'a community in its hour of greatest need now lie in the eternal company of the Imam in whose service they spent every breath of their lives. Peace be upon you, O 2 sons of Sayyid Abu Ahmed al-Hussein. Peace be upon you, O 2 sons of Sayyidah Fatima, daughter of the grandson of Imam Zayn al-Abidin. Peace be upon you, O 2 brothers of Baghdad, who were separated by 30 years of the elder's lonely grief, and who now rest beside each other where no separation can ever reach you again. Peace be upon you, O 2 inheritors of the Dar al-Ilm, O 2 servants of Nahj al-Balagha, O 2 architects of the scholarly tradition we have inherited, O two lights of the Karkh quarter of Baghdad, when the world was still young and the Buyid window still open. Peace be upon you, salutations upon you, peace upon you, mercy upon you, and the blessings of God upon you, in this life and in the life to come. And now let us raise our eyes from the graves, because the two brothers did not live and die for themselves. They did not build the Hawza, preserve the Hadith, dispatch their students across the Mediterranean, sell their estates, endure the fire of 422, carry 30 years of grief for their own glory or their own name. Everything they built was in the service of the one whom they knew they would never meet in this world. Everything was built so as to prepare a community that would be worthy of his return. O Master of the Age, O Proof of God, O Son of Hasan al-Askari, O Son of Fatima, peace be upon you, O Argument of God in his lands. Peace be upon you, O Sight of God amongst his creatures. Peace be upon you, O Light of God in the darkness of the earth. Peace be upon you, O Awaited One, for whose coming the prophets wept, and to whose banner every messenger before Prophet Muhammad and his family pointed. Sayyid al-Radhi was born in 359 of the Hijrah. Sayyid al-Murtadha died in 436. Between these two dates, in the very generations in which the two brothers lived their lives, the greater occultation of our 12th Imam had begun, the year 329, just 30 years before Sayyid al-Radhi's birth, the Ghaybat-e-Kubra. And they understood, with a clarity that centuries have sometimes dimmed for those who came after them, what the occultation meant. It did not mean that the Imam, may our souls be his ransom, had abandoned his community. The occultation was not his absence from us. It was our unreadiness to receive him. It did not mean that the community was excused from responsibility. The occultation was not a permission to sleep. It was a summons to prepare. It did not mean that the believer should retreat into private devotion and wait passively for a reappearance that would sweep away all evil and require nothing of him. The occultation was and is an active awaiting. A wait that demands of every believer that they become in their own lives, in their own family, in their own communities, the kind of believer worthy of serving under the banner of the Imam when he returns. That is why Sayyid al-Radhi compiled al-Balagha. That is why Sayyid al-Murtadha sold his lands for paper. That is why they built the Dar al-Ilm. That is why they trained Sheikh al-Tusi. That is why they dispatched the many people they dispatched across the world. Because every stone they laid, every manuscript they copied, every student that was fed was a stone in the foundation of a community waiting for the Imam, a community that would, God willing, one day be ready. And let me say this plainly, because if there is one thing that this 4-week session should leave in our hearts, is this: the occultation continues because we are not yet ready. Every generation of sincere believers, from Sayyid al-Radhi's generation to our own, carries a portion of the responsibility for preparing the ground for the return of the Imam. Every act of honest scholarship brings the day closer. Every act of genuine justice brings the day closer. Every believing father who raises his child on the love of Ahlul Bayt and truth brings the day closer. Every believing mother who teaches her children to pray and understand what prayer is brings that day closer. Every scholar who engages the world's confusion with patience and rigor brings that day closer. Every believer who refuses to be drawn into sectarian hate, who meets their neighbor, Sunni, Christian, Jewish, atheist, with the dignity that the Quran commands, brings that day closer. Every one of us who works at being the kind of servant that the Imam, may our souls be his ransom, would recognize as worthy, brings the day closer. And every act of negligence, every surrender to despair, every retreat into passivity, every word of cruelty spoken in the name of our tradition, every moment in which we would exchange the inheritance of Ahlul Bayt for the cheap currencies of this world, pushes that day closer. Oh Allah, we ask that you continue to help us and hasten the return of Imam al-Hujjah and count us among those who are his true followers and those who he is happy with and not those who upset him. Wa akhiru da'wani alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.